On October 3, 1847, in the quiet, pine-shrouded stretches of Rowan County, Georgia, a discovery was made that would shake the region's historical foundations. A discovery so strange, so grotesque, that even seasoned archivists hesitated before turning each page. It began with the belongings of a man named Thaddeus Boone, a wealthy plantation owner, a respected church patron, a man known across the county for his discipline, his precision, and his chillingly calm demeanor. But beneath that polished exterior was a darkness so methodical, so carefully arranged, that the truth only emerged after his death. Because Thaddeus Boone kept journals. Not diaries. Not ledgers. But records of punishment. Records written in immaculate cursive, line after line, documenting cruelty with the cold detachment of a scientist observing an experiment. For decades nothing was known. Nothing suspected. Nothing questioned. Not until the discovery of Journal 1. A brown leather-bound book, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a rotting cedar chest, hidden beneath the floorboards of Boone's abandoned study. When archivists opened it, the room fell silent. Because the first page contained only one sentence. Every action must be accounted for. Every punishment must be preserved for memory. And below it the date. January 6, 1839. This was no ordinary document. This was an archive of torment. A handwritten catalogue of suffering inflicted upon the enslaved men, women, and children of Boone's estate. But to understand these journals, to understand the mind behind them, we have to go back to where it started. The Boone legacy. Thaddeus Boone came from a line of landowners stretching back to colonial Virginia. His father, Elias Boone, was stern but unremarkable, a man concerned mainly with cotton yields and county politics. His mother, Marjorie, seldom appeared in written records, and after her death when Thaddeus was 12, the boy was raised in an environment where affection was sparse, but order was everything. From a young age, Thaddeus displayed a fixation on structure. He recorded everything, his chores, his meals, even the hours he slept. Neighbors called him bookish. Teachers called him brilliant. Workers on the farm called him something else. The Watcher. Because Thaddeus watched. Quietly. Constantly. He watched animals as they were slaughtered, not with fear or disgust, but fascination. He observed illness, injury, discipline, cataloging, comparing, analyzing. Nothing escaped him. So when his father died in 1838 and Thaddeus inherited the estate at age 25, the community expected a strict master. They were not prepared for what came next. The estate transforms. When Thaddeus assumed control, the shape of Boone's plantation changed almost overnight. He expanded the barns. He installed new workshops. He ordered architects to draw up unusual structures, long, narrow sheds with barred windows and reinforced doors. Locals whispered. Some claimed he was building new storage spaces. Others said they looked too similar to confinement pens used in older slave camps. But Thaddeus dismissed every concern. He remained polite, courteous, always composed. Yet the enslaved people noticed the shift immediately. Because Thaddeus had a rule. Nothing happened on the plantation without being written down. He carried small notebooks with him everywhere, recording how long someone worked, how long someone rested, how quickly they responded when he called their name, how often they slowed, stumbled, or looked away. He wasn't supervising. He was studying. And where others saw human beings, Thaddeus saw data. The first entries. Journal 1 revealed his earliest recorded punishments. The handwriting was elegant, smooth, almost beautiful, but the content was anything but. One entry read, March 14, 1839. Elijah hesitated before lifting bail. Applied 3 lashes for correction. Noted minimal resistance. Improvement expected. Another. April 2, 1839. Ruth failed to rise at first bell. Confined to the narrow shed for 6 hours. Recorded her reaction to darkness and limited space. These weren't punishments designed to maintain order. They were experiments. Controlled conditions. Variables. Outcomes. Every detail documented without emotion. And as the entries continued, a pattern emerged. Thaddeus escalated slowly, deliberately, measuring not just physical endurance, but psychological breaking points. The community looks away. Strangely, Thaddeus remained respected. Admired even. He donated to the church. He attended county meetings. He hosted dinners for local officials who praised his efficiency. Because the enslaved people on his plantation worked harder and faster than those anywhere else. No one questioned why. No one asked what methods he used. And those who did notice the odd structures, or the unusual silence around his fields, quickly learned to say nothing. In the 1840s, wealth meant influence. Influence meant power. And power meant privacy. Thaddeus used all three. A master obsessed with memory. What disturbed archivists the most about his journals wasn't the brutality itself. Sadly, cruelty was not uncommon in that era. What made Thaddeus unique, what made his writings horrifying, was the precision. His records detailed posture, tone, breathing rate. He measured how long it took for someone to cry. He noted whether they begged or remained silent. Every reaction was a clue. Every punishment a lesson. Not for the victim, but for him. Because Thaddeus Boone wasn't simply enforcing discipline. He was collecting information. Preparing something. Perfecting something. Something no one understood until the later journals were uncovered. Journals far worse than the first. But those come later. For now, this is where the darkness begins. And the deeper we go, the more horrifying the truth becomes. On a cold morning in February of 1848, more than 6 months after Thaddeus Boone's death, Rowan County archivist Margaret Ellery arrived at the estate to begin cataloging his personal effects. She expected financial records, land deeds, receipts for cotton shipments. She did not expect what she found. The Boone house had been abandoned since the funeral. Dust coated every step of the grand staircase. The windows were so clouded with age that morning sunlight seeped in like a faint gray mist. Ellery described the atmosphere later in her report. The house felt occupied. Though I knew Thaddeus Boone was dead, something in that place remained watchful. Her work began in the study, the room Thaddeus had spent most of his final years in. A large oak desk sat in the center, its drawers locked tight. But Margaret wasn't interested in the obvious. She noticed something else. A section of floorboard beneath the rear bookshelf that sounded hollow. She removed her gloves, pressed her fingertips along the seams, and felt a slight shift in the wood. Within minutes, she uncovered a concealed hatch. Under it sat a cedar storage chest, swollen with age, the metal hinges covered in rust. When she pried it open, the smell of old leather and mildew filled the room. Inside were multiple items. A bundle of bloodied cloth, 2 iron cuffs, a small jar of powdered lime, and beneath all of it, 6 journals, bound in leather, wrapped in oilcloth, numbered with Roman numerals. 2, 3, 4, 6. Journal 1, found earlier by maintenance workers, had been disturbing. But these were something else entirely. Margaret opened Journal 2, and the first page nearly made her drop the book. Read. June 3, 1840. Today begins the second phase. There were sketches, measurements, detailed diagrams of restraints Thaddeus designed himself. Charts documenting reactions to deprivation, to isolation, to fear. One page contained only 3 words. Silence increases efficiency. But what froze Margaret in place? What made her step back from the desk and steady herself? Was a line repeated 16 times across a page halfway through the book. A person breaks the same way no matter who they are. Each repetition darker than the last. Each stroke more forceful. As if he'd written it not for documentation, but for reassurance. As Margaret continued reading, the truth crystallized. Thaddeus Boone wasn't punishing the enslaved. He was studying the limits of human endurance. Emotionally, physically, psychologically. With the detachment of a scientist, the obsession of a collector, and the calm of a man who believed he was doing nothing wrong. The Boone estate, a lab in disguise. Outside the journals, clues scattered across the property confirmed what the entries suggested. The narrow sheds were lined with iron bolts and pulleys, far too sophisticated for mere punishment. A storage barn contained dozens of lanterns arranged in rows, their brightness varying by degree. Journal 3 explained why. Light deprivation induces confusion. Light excess induces panic. Both conditions valuable. The reinforced doors? Not for containment. For sound control. Thaddeus studied how long a person could endure silence. Then how long they could endure unending noise. He timed reactions. Measured tremors. Counted tears. One chilling entry read. Test subject, Anna, age 12. Duration under sustained noise, 4 hours, 22 minutes. Reactions recorded precisely. He didn't call them people. He called them test subjects. This was no plantation. This was a controlled environment of torment. A hidden laboratory, cloaked under the normal operations of Southern slavery. The section labeled Failures. Journal 4 contained a section marked with a simple word. Failures. Inside were names crossed out with red ink. Dozens of them. Each name followed by a short note. Collapsed early. Resistance unexpectedly strong. Mortality achieved before full reaction observed. One line, however, stood out, written darker, deeper, as if pressed hard into the page. Failure 27. Samuel, attempted escape. Outcome, permanent removal. Permanent removal was Thaddeus's chosen phrase for death. Margaret later wrote, "Reading that book felt like standing inside the mind of a man who believed suffering was a form of art. The strange behavior of the workers. The enslaved community, freed only after Boone's death, refused to enter the study. They refused to speak his name. Some wouldn't even approach the house at all. But when county officials questioned them, a pattern emerged. They described Thaddeus's habits exactly as his journals recorded. He observed constantly. He wrote constantly. He modified his methods constantly." One freed man recalled, "He never punished out of anger. That would have made him human. He punished to learn. That made him something else." Another said, "Thaddeus didn't see us as people. We were pages in his book. And he meant to fill every page." But perhaps the most chilling statement came from an elderly woman named Serena. "He wasn't studying us. He was studying what he could get away with. And he got away with much. Because no one questioned a wealthy white man's efficiency. No one questioned his discipline. No one questioned his silence. In Rowan County, cruelty never had to hide. It only had to be organized. And Thaddeus Boone was nothing if not organized. The journal that changed everything." When Margaret reached Journal 6, she hesitated before opening it. It was heavier than the others. Thicker. The leather darker, as if stained by something more than time. Inside, the entries were shorter. Choppier. More frenzied. Thaddeus wrote of advancements, refinements, and the perfect formula. Whatever he was building toward, whatever final conclusion he believed he had reached, he died before he could complete it. But the final pages revealed something the community had never known. Thaddeus planned to publish his findings. He intended to present them as a treatise on behavioral correction to prominent landowners in Georgia and South Carolina, a systematized method of breaking spirits efficiently, a handbook of cruelty, a manual of suffering. Had he lived another year, he may have succeeded. But death cut his work short. And what he left behind were the journals, the only window into a mind that sought not power, but mastery. Mastery over fear. Mastery over pain. Mastery over human beings. The kind of mastery no one was meant to see. But now it was undeniable. Thaddeus Boone documented everything. And those documents were about to expose him. The discovery of the journals should have been enough to ignite outrage across Rowan County. But outrage was a luxury reserved for those with power. And the people Thaddeus Boone harmed had never been allowed that privilege. Margaret Ellery delivered the journals to county officials. And within hours, the reaction was exactly what she feared. Silence. The sheriff skimmed a few pages, placed a heavy hand on the stack, and said, "Best not stir up ghosts, Miss Ellery. Boone's dead. Let the past die with him." But the past had no intention of dying. In the weeks that followed, the Boone estate became a beacon, not for the curious but for the uneasy. Neighbors reported lights flashing in the abandoned windows at night. Others claimed they saw figures standing on the porch after dusk. But no one went inside. Except Margaret. She could not forget the final entry she'd read, a fragmented sentence scribbled in the last journal. "They watch even now." At first she assumed Thaddeus meant the enslaved community. Survivors. Witnesses. But the deeper she went into the journals, the less certain she became. Thaddeus wrote about more than his experiments. He wrote about the house. He wrote about the land. And most disturbingly, he wrote about something he called the observation room. It took Margaret days to locate it. Behind a panel in the second-floor hallway, she found a narrow passageway leading into the walls of the house. Dust clung to her clothing as she moved through the cramped corridor, her oil lantern swelling shadows around her like breathing shapes. At the end of the passage was a small chamber. The walls were covered with tiny peepholes, more than 30 of them, each pointing to a different room in the house. Some toward the parlor. Some toward the dining room. Some toward the workers' quarters. Deep grooves in the wooden floor showed where a chair had once been pulled back and forth for years. This was where Thaddeus had spent his nights. Watching. Listening. Recording. He hadn't simply documented punishments. He documented people living under the constant threat of punishment. This room was his vantage point. The journals were his reflection. But the darkest revelation emerged from the single peephole facing the rear sheds, the ones the workers always avoided speaking about. Through that hole, Margaret could see directly into a small chamber containing a heavy wooden table and iron restraints. A detail struck her instantly. The iron wasn't rusted. It was polished. Even though the house had been abandoned for months, someone had kept that table clean long after Thaddeus died. Someone who had access. Someone who still believed in his methods. For the first time since entering the estate, Margaret felt true fear. She hurried back down the passage, forcing herself not to run, reminding herself of every official who told her this was a closed matter. But she knew better now. The journals weren't just a record of Thaddeus Boone's cruelty. They were a blueprint. And someone else, someone still alive, might have been preparing to follow it. Rumors spread quickly through the freed community once word of the journals leaked. Former workers gathered in small, hidden groups. Some spoke of the strange sounds they had heard at night near the sheds. Others admitted they had seen lanterns glowing inside rooms that should have remained sealed after Thaddeus's death. But one story surfaced above all others. A man named Abram, who had worked under Thaddeus longer than anyone, revealed something no one else had dared to voice. Thaddeus had not been working alone. In the final years of his life, he met regularly with a small gathering of men from nearby counties. They came only at night. They entered through the back of the property. Thaddeus called them the Circle. The enslaved had another name for them. The Witnesses. They were not witnesses to cruelty. They were witnesses for cruelty. Supporters. Admirers. Men who believed Thaddeus was on the verge of perfecting a method that could change the entire system. Abram spoke quietly as if afraid the very dirt might overhear him. He wasn't writing for himself. He was writing for them. They wanted a manual. A guide. Something they could use to control their own people. Margaret felt a chill. If the journals fell into their hands, if the Circle recovered those methods, Thaddeus Boone might be dead. But his influence would not be. Not unless the journals were exposed to the world, beyond the reach of local officials, beyond the control of the men who protected him. Margaret made a decision. She would take the journals to the state capitol. Directly to the governor's office. Directly into the hands of someone who could not be bribed or intimidated by Rowan County elites. But someone else had already made a decision too. The night before Margaret was to leave, the Boone estate caught fire. Flames rose so high they illuminated the surrounding fields like daylight. The house collapsed inward with a groaning roar, sending embers spiraling into the sky. Neighbors ran from miles around, but the fire was too powerful, too complete, too precise. Everything burned. The study. The hidden room. The cedar chest. Everything but one thing. Margaret had taken the journals home with her hours earlier. Whatever force, or whoever, burned the Boone estate believed they were destroying the evidence. They weren't. They were merely confirming its importance. The next morning, Margaret left Rowan County. Behind her, smoke still curled from the charred remains of the Boone house, drifting upward like a signal, or a warning. And as her horse-drawn wagon rolled down the dirt road leading out of the county, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by a person. By a legacy. A legacy Thaddeus Boone had crafted through ink and cruelty. A legacy that still had followers. A legacy that did not want to be exposed. Margaret kept the journals close, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath her coat. She would not fail. Not now. Not after seeing the truth. Because Thaddeus Boone had spent his life documenting the suffering of others. Now at last, it was time to document his. Margaret Ellery's journey to the capital began before dawn, long before Rowan County fully woke. Frost dusted the grass. The air was still. And the journals, those 14 leather-bound records of human torment, lay wrapped in a wool blanket beside her as though they were fragile, living things. She kept glancing at them, half expecting the leather to move. Thaddeus Boone had written every page with cold precision. But the weight of those pages now felt alive. As she rode through the county line, Margaret believed the worst was behind her. She was wrong. The first sign came only miles outside St. Helena Parish, a rider trailing her from a distance. Not close enough to confront her. Not far enough to be dismissed as coincidence. He stayed behind her for nearly an hour, maintaining the same slow pace, the same silent watchfulness. Margaret increased her speed. So did the rider. She veered off the main road. He followed. At a fork in the dirt path, she turned sharply into the pine woods, the wagon wheels kicking up clouds of dust. Branches scraped her coat. Leaves whipped against her face. But the rider hesitated, just long enough to lose her trail. Margaret pressed onward. By midday, she had traveled far enough that trees grew unfamiliar and the sound of distant watermills replaced the faint humming of the Boone estate fields. But she sensed it. She was not alone. Further south, she reached a small riverside town called Stillford. A modest settlement, barely 20 homes, its people wary of outsiders. Margaret tethered her horse near the inn, slipping the journals beneath her shawl. Inside, the innkeeper greeted her with a polite nod, followed by a frown of faint recognition. "You're from Rowan County, ain't you?" His tone carried something weighted, fear, or warning. "I'm passing through," she answered. The man leaned closer. "Passing through is wise." She felt her pulse tighten. "What do you mean?" He glanced around the empty inn, then lowered his voice. "There were men in here last night, asking if anyone saw a woman traveling alone. Said she carried books. Important ones. They described you." Margaret stiffened. The innkeeper continued, "They said if you came through, I was to send word north. Quick like." She took a slow breath. "What did you tell them?" "That no such woman came through. And I aim to keep saying that. But you shouldn't stay long. They'll be back." She thanked him quietly. But before she turned to leave, the innkeeper added one last whisper. They wore the same sign. A small circle pinned to their coats. Margaret froze. The circle. Thaddeus Boone's secret assembly. He wasn't acting alone. And now they were hunting for the journals. Margaret made the decision instantly. She could not continue on the main road. The circle would expect that. Instead, she traveled deeper into backcountry territory, following old river trails and long-forgotten trading paths. The landscape grew wilder. Dense forests swallowed light. Creeks cut jagged paths through the soil. Shadows stretched in unnatural shapes. And all throughout the journey, Margaret felt the tension of being stalked, not by an animal but by intention. She didn't rest. She didn't slow. Not until nightfall forced her to. She reached an abandoned barn near a crossroads. It offered shelter but little comfort. The wind screeched through the broken shingles like a wounded thing. Margaret set her lantern on an overturned crate, opened the wool blanket and stared again at the journals. It was then she noticed something strange. One journal, the thinnest of the 14, had a different stitching pattern on its spine. Not leather thread, but horsehair. She had flipped through the pages before, but never with suspicion. Now, under lantern light, she saw it. The last page wasn't properly glued. It lifted slightly at the corner. Margaret slid her fingernail beneath it and peeled it back. Behind the page, behind Thaddeus Boone's final cold sentence, lay another sheet. One he had hidden. A page written in smaller, tighter handwriting. A confession. Read. "If they learn what I discovered, they will continue my work. Not out of science. Out of fear. I could break obedience. But I could not break will. No one can. Not even them." The next lines were darker. He wrote of experiments he abandoned. Of methods even he considered beyond the line. He wrote of members of the circle pushing him toward cruelty he couldn't stomach. He wrote of a demonstration they demanded shortly before his death. And then, the ink changed color as though the entry had been finished on a different night, or in a different state of mind. The final line read, "If they find this, they will silence anyone who carries these books. Anyone. They are watching." Margaret's breath caught. She folded the hidden page back into place just as footsteps cracked outside the barn. Slow. Measured. Multiple. 3 shadows moved past the cracks in the wooden slats. Then a 4th. Margaret tightened her grip around the journals. The footsteps stopped right outside the barn door. Someone tried the handle. Then another voice, low, male, steady, broke the silence. "Miss Ellery, we know you have them. Let us in. We only want to talk." Margaret backed away from the door. Another voice followed, colder than the first. "Thaddeus Boone trusted us. Don't dishonor the man's work." The temperature in the barn felt as though it dropped 10 degrees. Margaret whispered to herself, "I won't let your work live." The handle rattled again, harder this time. The circle wasn't going to talk. They were going to finish what Thaddeus started. Margaret blew out the lantern and slipped through a rear opening in the barn's collapsed wall, disappearing into the darkness. Behind her, the men forced their way in. Their footsteps echoed through the hollow structure as she ran. The journals pressed against her chest. The final truth burning in her mind. Thaddeus Boone may have been the one who documented cruelty. But he was not the last man who wanted to preserve it. Margaret fled through the night, the journals pressed tightly against her chest, weaving through pine forests, over rocky streams and across abandoned farmland. Every snap of a twig made her heart pound. Every distant sound reminded her she was being hunted. The circle was relentless. Thaddeus Boone's legacy was alive, and it had followers willing to kill to preserve it. Dawn found her at the banks of a slow, wide river. The cold water licked her legs as she waded across, the journals protected by layers of cloth, hidden beneath her coat. On the other side, she paused only long enough to rest against an oak tree. Her breath came in gasps, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still. But the journals were not silent. They carried the weight of history, of human suffering meticulously recorded, and now the responsibility of exposing it rested on her shoulders. Weeks later, after traveling hundreds of miles through towns and back roads, Margaret delivered the journals to officials in the state capital. These were men who could not be bought or intimidated by Rowan County's elite. They examined the entries in disbelief, slowly understanding the calculated cruelty of Thaddeus Boone. Not random acts of violence, but experiments, studies, and cold observation of human suffering. The public records, once released, sent shockwaves. The journals were published and disseminated, not in full detail to avoid trauma, but with enough evidence to ensure Thaddeus Boone's methods could never be replicated. People finally understood the depths of cruelty hidden behind the polite, composed facade of the wealthy landowner. Survivors of Boone's estate, once silenced by fear, finally had their voices heard. They testified about the inhumane punishments, the experiments, and the psychological torment meticulously documented in the journals. The world now knew the truth of a man who turned his estate into a laboratory of suffering. And yet, some things remained unsolved. Who among the circle survived? Were there followers of Boone's methods still in hidden corners of the South? The journals were only a partial victory. They revealed the cruelty, yes, but they also reminded the world how closely power and silence are intertwined, and how easily the powerless can be exploited. In the end, Thaddeus Boone became more than a man. He became a cautionary tale, a story of obsession, cruelty, and the human capacity to document suffering with scientific detachment. His legacy lived not in continued acts of cruelty, but in the journals that finally exposed the truth to the world. The house burned, the circle scattered, and the survivors reclaimed fragments of their lives. Yet even today the Boone estate ruins stand as a reminder. Shadows of the past linger. Echoes of the pain recorded in ink that refused to fade. Margaret Ellery's bravery ensured the world would remember. Because stories like Thaddeus Boone's are not just history, they are warnings, lessons carved into the conscience of anyone who studies them. If this story unsettled you, if it made your skin crawl or your heart tighten, then remember this. History is full of hidden truths, of shadows where the powerful tried to hide the suffering of the powerless. At Hidden Tales, we bring these stories into the light. Stories of cruelty, injustice, and the human spirit that survived against all odds. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to uncovering the truths others wish were forgotten. By commenting, you help amplify voices that history tried to silence. And by sharing, you ensure these lessons reach those who need to understand the past, so the mistakes, horrors, and dark obsessions of men like Thaddeus Boone are never repeated. Your engagement matters. Every view, every like, every comment ensures that these hidden tales are remembered. They are not just stories, they are warnings, reflections, and remembrances. So, if you want to continue exploring the forgotten corners of history, the tales buried under centuries of silence, subscribe to Hidden Tales. Turn on notifications. Share this story with someone who appreciates the depth of truth. More stories await. More secrets linger. And together we will ensure they are never hidden again.